The ferry from Cordova doesn't run every day, and by the time I reached that family dinner, my patience had already run out. But before I tell you what happened that night, you need to know what my life was really like, and why Brad thought I was someone he could laugh at. I'm a commercial fisherman. I don't own a big fleet or manage crews from an office. I'm the one on the water before 4 in the morning during salmon season, pulling heavy gill nets with my dad's old crew. Most of the older fishermen have retired, and very few young people want this job anymore. Fishing in Cordova isn't glamorous. It's freezing, wet, and exhausting. By sunrise, your clothes smell like fish, your hands are rough from salt water, and that smell follows you for months. My mom, Ivory, always wanted me to leave town, go to college in Anchorage, and find an easier career. My older sister, Briella, did exactly that. She moved to Seattle when she was 18, earned a marketing degree, and came back 4 years later with a fiancé and a strong opinion about every choice I'd made. I never blamed her for leaving. What bothered me was how she acted after she came home. She talked as if Cordova was a place she'd escaped from, and I was someone who had never managed to leave. Her fiancé, Brad, wasn't much different. I'd only met him twice before that dinner. He laughed loudly, wore an expensive watch, and had the habit of saying, "No offense," right before insulting someone. He worked in commercial real estate in Seattle, dealing with shopping centers and retail properties. Whenever he talked about Cordova, he sounded less like a visitor and more like a scientist studying a small town full of strange, simple people. Briella got engaged in April. By June, she decided to bring Brad to see where she grew up. She planned a family dinner at one of the nicest restaurants on the harbor, the Salmon Run. What she didn't know was that I owned it. Actually, nobody in my family knew. And I intended to keep it that way. 3 years earlier, Pete Kowalski, who had owned the Salmon Run for nearly 30 years, told me over coffee that he was ready to retire. His knees were giving out and his wife wanted to move to Arizona to be closer to family. He wasn't advertising the restaurant for sale. He only mentioned it because I sold fresh salmon directly to him from my boat. While we were talking, he admitted he hoped someone local would buy the place instead of an outside investor who would turn it into another tourist attraction. I didn't answer him that day. Instead, I went home and spent the next week running numbers. I'd saved more money than most people realized. I started fishing when I was 19. I lived in the same house my grandfather built, never wasted money on expensive trucks or fancy vacations, and put away as much as I could after every good season. Fishing income comes in waves. A strong season can provide enough savings to last for years if you're careful. I also owned a small piece of land that my grandfather had left me. When I sold it to a family planning to build near the airport, I finally had enough for a down payment. After combining that money with my savings and a loan from the local credit union, which trusted me because they'd known me since I was a teenager, I was able to buy the restaurant. I kept the purchase quiet. Not because I was embarrassed, but because I liked my life. The only person I told was Marcus, the restaurant's kitchen manager. He had worked for Pete for 11 years and I needed him to stay. I wasn't giving up fishing to stand behind a hostess stand every night. Marcus agreed to keep my secret. I enjoyed being known as Murphy the fisherman, not Murphy the restaurant owner. The moment people think you own something, they start treating you differently. For 3 years, everyone talked to me like they always had, and I wanted to keep it that way. So when Briella called and said she wanted to have our family dinner at the Salmon Run while she and Brad were visiting, I simply said, "Sounds good." I never mentioned that the restaurant belonged to me. The evening of the dinner, Cordova looked beautiful. It was one of those July nights when the sun barely disappears. The light hung over the mountains, turning the harbor a warm shade of gold. I just finished a long day on the water. After showering at home, I put on the only nice dress I owned that wasn't meant for funerals and drove to the restaurant. I felt tired, but it was the satisfying kind of tired that comes after an honest day's work. My parents were already sitting at the table. My mom, Ivory, looked nervous. She always did whenever Briella brought guests home, as if she expected someone to criticize the house, the town, or even the wallpaper. My dad, Wayne, looked exactly as he always had. Quiet. Comfortable. A man who had spent 40 years working on fishing boats and no longer felt the need to impress anyone. If you'd like, I can rewrite the next segment in the same style so the entire story stays consistent. Briella and Brad arrived a few minutes after I did. Brad was wearing a fancy blazer that looked completely out of place in a small harbor town. As he looked around the dining room, his eyes moved over the wooden beams and the old crab pots hanging on the walls, as if he were judging how much the building was worth instead of enjoying it. We sat down, ordered drinks, and for the first 10 minutes, everything was pleasant. Brad talked about a business deal he had closed in Bellevue. Briella laughed a little too hard at his stories. My mom politely asked questions about their wedding plans. Then our menus arrived. Brad opened his menu, glanced at the prices, smiled, and said loudly enough for the next table to hear, "Try not to order anything too expensive, Murphy. We all know your job isn't exactly impressive." He laughed like it was a harmless joke. Like everyone at the table was supposed to laugh with him. Briella gave a small, uncomfortable laugh, unsure of how to react. My mother's expression tightened. My father became perfectly still, the same way he did on the fishing boat right before saying something serious. I stayed quiet. I wish I could tell you I fired back with a clever answer, but that isn't what happened. Instead, I felt the familiar heat rise behind my ears. It was the same feeling I'd had for years whenever people asked if I was still fishing, as if it were just a temporary job I should have outgrown. I closed my menu and looked out at the harbor instead of looking at Brad. I wasn't silent because he'd won. I was silent because I was deciding whether he deserved the truth, or whether I should let him keep talking until he embarrassed himself even more. About a minute later, Marcus walked out of the kitchen. Marcus almost never visited tables himself. He trusted his servers to take care of the customers. The only exception was me. Every time I came in, he greeted me personally. It had become our private tradition. He always acted surprised that I'd finally decided to visit my own restaurant. He walked straight over with a big smile, wiped his hands on his apron, and offered me a handshake. "Miss Hayes," he said warmly, "we're honored to have you here. The staff has been wondering when you'd stop by your own restaurant again." The words hit Briella first. Confusion crossed her face. Then realization. I could almost see her replaying the past 3 years in her mind, trying to figure out how I'd managed to keep something this important a secret. My mother's mouth slowly fell open. My dad quietly lifted his water glass to hide the smile he couldn't quite keep off his face. Brad looked completely lost. "What do you mean, her restaurant?" he asked, forcing a laugh that sounded anything but relaxed. Marcus smiled. "Miss Hayes bought the place from Pete a few years ago," he said. "Best thing that ever happened to this restaurant, if you ask me." Then, like the professional he was, he wished us a good meal and returned to the kitchen without getting involved in our family drama. Silence settled over the table. Outside, gulls cried over the harbor while a fishing boat engine rumbled in the distance. I let the silence stay exactly where it was. I'd earned that moment. Finally, I smiled. "I bought the restaurant about 3 weeks before you two made your reservation," I said calmly. "Funny how small the world can be." Brad tried to laugh it off. "Well, how was I supposed to know?" But there was no easy way to recover. Just minutes earlier he'd mocked my job. Now he knew the woman he'd insulted owned the restaurant, employed the man who had just greeted her with respect, and could have asked him to leave if she wanted. He knew it. His face turned bright red. Under different circumstances, I might have felt sorry for him. Instead, I simply watched him struggle. Briella barely spoke for the rest of dinner. I could tell she wasn't just thinking about the restaurant. She was remembering every conversation we'd had over the years. Every time she'd suggested I should find a real career. Every time she'd asked if I ever got tired of smelling like the docks. For the first time, she seemed to realize she had never really understood the life I'd chosen. I can continue rewriting the next segment in the same style and tone to keep the entire story consistent.